Welcome back to Canadian Justice, where we're discussing what the election of Donald Trump might mean for trade between Canada and the United States. Mark, in the last segment, we were talking a little bit about China's role in driving Trump's rhetoric about tariffs. Now, of course, he's not talked about imposing tariffs exclusively on China, but it does seem to be driving his thinking. So, how does China fit into the economic calculus on tariffs, and how much of these tariffs do you think will be aimed more at China or versus aimed at Canada?
So I think it's worth thinking that two things happened in close succession in the beginning towards the end of the 90s. The WTO agreement came into effect. It was the high point of liberalized trade, if you like. The Americans had certain expectations of what that would mean in terms of access to other countries, had certain expectations of what it would mean in terms of the WTO system, which is very different than what the rest of the world thought that they had agreed to. Canada had a role in that in terms of a legalized dispute settlement system. Secondly, China acceded to the WTO and also around that time became a major exporter. And all of the worst fears of both of those things have really turned out to be the case. China has become a low cost producer and has shipped lots of stuff on the market. So they've worked their way into supply chains. Great for consumers, but it's actually decimated manufacturing in the United States and in other countries. And that's kind of what's driving a lot of this. So whether Trump can get it back by tariffs on China is another matter. What we're seeing is that production is moving to Vietnam, to other places in Southeast Asia, and to Mexico. And the question going forward, I guess, is going to be just how deeply does Donald Trump intend to go in taking China out of the American supply chain? If he goes very deep, then of course if you think of what Mexico and Canada were fighting the United States on in the first real dispute under the USMCA successor to NAFTA, it was over the rules of origin. I always call that a dispute over how much Chinese auto parts could really be counted as Canadian or Mexican. And we thought we won that case. And now basically the Americans have said, well, we're not implementing that. We did an agreement with Canada and Mexico, not with China. And now I think, from what I can see, the Canadian government seems to have thrown that overboard, not officially, but in aligning with American policy. So that's really the question are the Americans serious about taking China out of the supply chain? Very hard to do, will be very inflationary. And then the question for Canada will be, how far are we prepared to align with that? So far, as I said, we seem to be aligning with electric vehicle tariffs and electric vehicle parts tariffs. As I said, that I don't know whether we've formally thrown that rules of origin case overboard. We've made some changes around Investment Canada and how we deal with Chinese investments by state-owned enterprises and critical minerals. But have we really taken China out of the Canadian supply chain? And that's going to tell a lot in terms of how Americans, I think, react to the Trudeau government. I also think it tells a lot of why in these early days after Trump's election that the Liberal government seems to be on every flight to Washington, because they know that the Trump people associate them as being very pro-Chinese.
Now, George, I'm curious if the Trump administration does impose tariffs on Canada, either targeted or across the board tariffs. How likely do you think it is that Canada would retaliate with our own tariffs? And if we do, what impact could we expect that to have on businesses, on consumers, and at what point do these escalating tariffs become what we would call a trade war?
So I think we'll take history as our guide. We've seen this movie before, at least in part, in 2018. So the U.S. put steel and aluminum tariffs coming out of Canada. In response, Canada says, okay, well, we're going to hit you with tariffs on steel and aluminum. But then there was this other like laundry list of goods that they listed. It was a list-based approach. So we're talking like yogurt, coffee, whiskey, mattresses, dishwashers, parts of boats. So all of that weird list-based stuff was basically trying to put pressure on members of Congress and the Senate to basically convince the Trump administration to lift these tariffs in Canada. And ultimately, the way Canada got those lifted was that they withheld signing the USMCA until the US lifted the tariffs. So what I expect is how Trump operates. I'm going to put tariffs on you. I have leverage. Now we're going to negotiate. So Canada's going to want to put something else on the table to bargain with. I anticipate it will be list-based because if we go across the board on US goods, the consumer is going to feel it and feel it pretty hard.
We've got to go to commercial break now, but when we come back, I want to talk about the renegotiation of the USMCA. We'll be right back.